So we find ourselves on some of the busiest travel days of the year. And in light of that, whether you plan on traveling or not, we'll tackle the some of the laws or some of the background and intricacies of the Tefillat Haderech, the Wayfarer's Prayer, and maybe provide some insight into whether or not you should or shouldn't say it, depending where you're going, and issues relating to travel. We start with a headline from yesterday. It's Thanksgiving week. These are expected to be the busiest travel days, right? This could probably be a headline from every year, except, maybe during COVID, there seems to be every year is the biggest travel year, but it's a busy week for millions of Americans who are traveling for Thanksgiving. At the nation's airports, the TSA expects to screen nearly 18 million people from the Tuesday before Thanksgiving to the Tuesday after the holiday, while the FAA expects this will be the busiest Thanksgiving in terms of flights in at least 15 years. Most people, however, will be traveling by car. AAA projects that overall 81.8 million people will travel 50 miles or more during the Thanksgiving holiday period. This year's domestic travel forecast includes an additional 1.6 million travelers compared to last Thanksgiving, setting a new overall record, it says. So the idea of traveling, certainly traveling 50 miles, getting on a road. What about, when do you say Tefillat Haderech? What do you say? Also, how dangerous is it? Now, travel can be, crossing the street can be dangerous, but there was an article last week that vehicle crash rate risk spikes 65% on Sunday after Thanksgiving, data shows. Flight delays in recent government shutdowns are pushing more travelers onto U.S. highways this Thanksgiving, raising the risks of wrecks down what is already one of the most dangerous travel periods of the year, data shows. Crash rate on Sunday after Thanksgiving is 65% higher compared with the previous Sunday, based on 2024 data analyzed by Samsara, the technology company that tracks commercial fleet safety. Kelly Sutherland, head of the insights at Samara, told CNN this year could be even more dangerous because of the surge in drivers. In its study, America's Most Dangerous Winter Roads, released Tuesday, Samsara analyzed data from 2022 to 2025. The results show a consistent pattern. Crash risk rises in winter regardless of fleet size or industry. Thanksgiving itself is usually safer, Sutherland says, because many people are off the road visiting family. The higher crash risk comes during transitional travel periods, especially the Sunday after the holiday. This year falls on November 30th. Samsara found the spike is driven by heavy congestion, long-distance travel, and driver fatigue. Millions of Americans are returning home, creating one of the busiest travel windows of the year. So we all know what it's like to travel, sit in traffic, especially anyone who ever takes the Van Wyck. It can be dangerous any day of the year, but more people on the road, maybe more danger. How does that relate to this idea of Tefillat Haderech, the Wayfarer's Prayer? So we'll first go back to the sources. This idea of a Wayfarer's Prayer is found within the concept or within the discussion of prayer in general. Right, the Gemara in Brachos is discussing davening and discussing really the idea of Shmona Esrei, and talks about what happens if a person is on the way, is on the journey. How do you factor in saying Shmona Esrei? Do you stop the journey? Do you get off the horse? Do you move? Can you adjust the prayer? And within that discussion, it raises some possible situations of danger, of diversion. And also, maybe the prayer, maybe the journey itself requires prayer. So Rabbi Yeshua says, one who is walking in a place of danger recites a brief prayer. Okay, you're in danger, you say a prayer. We can appreciate that sentiment. The sages taught one who walks in a place where there are groups of wild beasts and robbers recites an abbreviated prayer. So the sages say if you're in an area that's danger, has animals or robbers, then there's an abbreviated prayer. This could be a reason that maybe you don't say the whole Shmona Esrei, because you have to pray, but you're in a dangerous place. You don't really have the peace of mind or the time to say your entire prayer service. So maybe this is talking about the idea of saying an abbreviated prayer for your morning prayer service, your davening. So what's that abbreviated prayer? Rabbi Eliezer says, carry out your will in the heavens above and give peace of mind to those who fear you below and perform that which is good in your eyes. Blessed are you, Lord, who listens to prayer. The Hebrew would be Baruch atah shomei tefillah. So, this is not based on any type of template. This is, kind of essentially, hey, we're on the road, God, give us peace of mind and make it all good for us, and hear our prayer. The idea when we think about the Shemona Esrei, the template that we use for the Shemona Esrei, that's part of the daily prayer service, right? That, according to tradition, comes from the Anshe Knesset Havdolah, comes from the men of the Great Assembly. This was the spiritual, religious, rabbinic body that was active at the beginning of the Second Temple period. And as Jewish people proceeded post-prophetic period, the last of the prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, as the Jews returned to Israel to construct the Second Temple, that was the end of the prophets. And then the rabbis took over the spiritual leadership and began to recognize that, especially in the relationship with God and speaking to God, you don't have prophets declaring God's message, and you want to maintain the open lines of communication. It would be helpful for there to be a standardized text for prayer. And they came up with the Shemona Esrei. That's how we understand its development. Here, this statement in the Talmud is coming a long time after that. We're talking, some 500-600 years post the Anshe Knesset Havdolah. There's a sense that, look, you can't always say the standardized text. You can't say the standardized text. You should introduce something else that is meaningful. So Rabbi Yeshua says that, remember, Rabbi Yeshua is one talked about saying a brief prayer. He recites, "Hear the cry of your nation Israel and quickly fulfill their request. Blessed are you, Lord, who listens to prayer." He says, if you're really in danger, you got to say it a little bit shorter. Right? Brings to mind the old, pithy expression that if you say rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub, yay God, that says the same thing as bench. Now, you should say the whole thing. But Rabbi Yeshua is saying, when in danger, say what you need to say and don't delay or don't slow it down. Acherim say, Acherim is, we're not sure, it's the other opinion. The need, you say, Merubim tzarchei amcha. The needs of your nation Israel are many, and they are unable to effectively articulate their thoughts in prayer. May it be your will, Lord our God, to provide each and every one with his necessary sustenance, and to each and everybody all that it lacks. Blessed are you, Lord, who listens to prayer. So he says you can't be so short. You have to you have to articulate a little bit more. You have to adjust it a little bit. It's not just enough to say to request something. You have to put it into context, and we know that because the Shemona Esrei that we say every day has a structure, right? It has praise, and then it has requests, and then it has thanksgiving. And so here too, it's the Acherim view is putting it into context. You have to set the tone first. Rav Huna said the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Acherim. You have to have more context. You shouldn't just jump into help us God. You have to have a little bit of an introduction, set the context, and the like. Okay, so that is the idea of being in a dangerous place and adjusting the prayer in accordance with the danger. Seems to be talking about your morning davening is adjusted because you're in danger and you can't say the whole thing. Rabbi Yaakov said that Rav Chisda said that anyone who sets out on a journey must recite the traveler's prayer prior to embarking on his journey. You have to say the Tefillat Haderech. You have to say the prayer before leaving. So now we get into very specifically say this prayer before going on a journey. And then on the next page, what is the Tefillat Haderech? And here I have it in Hebrew so we can look at the words because it's very much what we say today. Hashem Elokai, shetolicheni l'shalom. Hashem, my God, I should travel, I should go towards peace. V'satzidenu l'shalom. V'sismecheni l'shalom. And support me and sustain me. V'satzileni mikaf kol oyev v'orev b'derech, any types of enemies or opponents on the way. V'sishlach bracha b'masa yadai, and you'll send blessing in the works of my hands. Put me in good graces, anyone who sees me. Baruch atah Hashem shomei tefillah. Okay, that's what you say. And it sounds very similar. One of the main differences, and this gets discussed and becomes part and parcel of the law, is that we say it in the plural. Similar to the prayers that we say every morning, we don't say, grant us wisdom, grant me wisdom. We say grant us wisdom. So we turn this into Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avosenu shetolichenu l'shalom. So, but this is essentially has all of the markings of the prayer that we say today. When does one pray? Rabbi Yaakov said that Rav Chisda said that when one sets out on his journey and not before. So you can't. So this is not a preemptive prayer. This is when you're on the journey. How long must one's planned journey be in order to require him to recite the prayer? Right. How far do you have to be traveling? Rabbi Yaakov said, Rav Chisda said, at least a parsec, several thousand amos, and comes out to a couple of miles. How does he recite the prayer? Rav Chisda says, only while standing in one place. Well, it's an important prayer, just like our Shemona Esrei we say while standing. Well, you should be saying it the same way here. Rav Shesha says, no, even when walking or sitting. All right, it kind of makes sense, and I'm sure we're thinking that this really reflects our practice. We don't generally make you get out of the car to say Tefillat Haderech. You say it in the car, but we see that there's some tension as to what's the best position. Is this really about being saved? Is this about praying? Is this a blessing? When is it said? We have some of the basic situations in front of us. We understand that this is about being protected, but what exactly do we say and how do we say it is filtered through the prism of various halachic discussion. And when we get to the conclusion, here we see how the Shulchan Aruch sums up the laws of the actual Tefillat Haderech in source number 4. So, one who will leave to travel should pray, may it be your will, Lord our God and the God of our ancestors, that you lead us to peace, etc. Right? You see already the Shulchan Aruch changed it from the singular to the plural formulation. And one must say it in the plural language. You have to say it. And if possible, one should refrain from going while one says it. And if one was riding, one need not dismount. So you see the tension of the end of the Talmud reflected in the Shulchan Aruch, right? You should not be saying it while moving. You should be stopping, but you don't have to get off the horse, right? And we'll have to talk a little bit about what that means when driving and the like. Is this something you should say before you get into the car? But that's not on the journey. If you already started the journey, do you stop the car? Is that on the journey? So these are some of the questions that will emerge, but we certainly see that this is idea of, we're saying this in the plural. It's kind of interesting. What happens if you're traveling alone? We still say it in the plural, and we'll have to see the idea that it's become very common, since it's recited in the plural, that if there's a group of people traveling together, to have one person recite it for all of them, because then the recitation in the plural is not only conceptual, but also actual. Source number 5, paragraph 5, it is not necessary to say this prayer more than once a day, even if one rests in the city in the middle of the day. But if one's thought is to lodge in the city and then afterwards one reconsiders and leaves it so as to pass outside of it or to return to one's home, one must go back and pray the prayer another time. So we see this idea that one, it's once a day. It's until you get off the road intentionally, right? If you're praying, if you're traveling a multi-day journey, you say at the beginning of the day and then you say it the next day. If you stop the journey in the middle of the day and you thought you were done and then continue, well, then that's called, in the Talmudic language, hesech hadas. You've removed your thoughts from traveling. So that prayer that you said for this travel day has now been interrupted. And then you would have to say it again. This comes up to some extent. If an analogous situation today would be if you are leaving one's home to drive a distance to the airport and then get on a plane. That's all one journey. You don't have to say more than one Tefillat Haderech. You say it once. Now, for some people you'll say Tefillat Haderech driving to the airport because you live quite a distance from the airport. If that's the case, you said Tefillat Haderech on the way to the airport, then you don't have to say Tefillat Haderech when you take off. If you don't say Tefillat Haderech on the way to the airport, then maybe saying if you haven't said it yet, then the airplane might be your first opportunity to Tefillat Haderech, as we will see. Paragraph 7 in source 4, one should say it after one has hit the road. I love how the Shulchan Aruch even has the expression "hit the road," or maybe that's what the translator did. And one should not say it other than in the case that one has to go a parsa. You have to be traveling at least 4 kilometers. But if less than a parsa, one should not end a prayer with Baruch. If you're not traveling in accordance with the criteria set out by the rabbis in the Talmud, then you don't say God's name. And ad initio, one should say it within the first parsha. You should say it as you depart. So if you're already too long onto the journey, it's a little bit too late. And when one forgot to say it, one may say it the entire time on the road, as long as you didn't reach the parsha adjacent to the city, as long as you're still 2 kilometers outside of the destination. And from that point on, one should say it without the blessing. So let's say you're traveling a distance and you forgot to say it at the beginning of the journey. You can say it until the end of the journey, until you're within 2 kilometers of the destination. Let's say you're still you're within 2 kilometers of the destination, even if you're like stuck in traffic and a half hour away. These days we can know how long this is all going to take. It says you should say it without the blessing. Now, this takes us into the issue of kind of, what does it mean to say a prayer without the full blessing, without God's name? On the one hand, you're still articulating the same sentiments: save us, protect us, help us reach in peace. On the other, it's a little bit lacking if you can't say, you can't say Hashem's name, you can't say God's name. What exactly does that mean about this prayer? Is this like a blessing over a glass of water? And that if it, that here, right, blessing over a glass of water, you take a sip of water without the blessing, you can take it to make another blessing, then you just take the sip of water, right? It's a blessing over something that's very definable and concrete. Is that the same thing here? And since this is not a concrete, quote unquote, glass of water, you don't say it? Or is this meant to be a prayer that's expressed? Why are we so careful? I'm on a journey. Why isn't that enough? And we'll have to dig down into that a little bit with regards to some of these situations. But it does seem that there's a few issues that emerge. One, it's a once a day, so no matter how far you're traveling or many stops you take along the way that day, it's a one-a-day experience. Two, it's meant to be, it can't be said before. There seems to be a certain on the way, but not too far on the way. And once you're too far on the way, there seems to be some controversy as to whether still to say it or not, or say it with a blessing, as well as what are the situations for which this is required. Is this any journey? Like I still remember that there was someone was pushing back at the text. Remember, if you go back to the Talmudic sources, the texts sometimes were just about just save us, keep us safe. And the other version of the text, the one which we actually incorporate into our Tefillat Haderech, is about animals and thieves and everything like that. So someone asked Rabbi Herschel Schachter, is it still relevant to talk about thieves and wild animals the way we travel? And he said, well, what about being carjacked, right? That is something that happens, and sometimes it happens more than others. Those are the listim that we talk about. Chayos ra'os, we talk about evil animals, right? We may not have lions and tigers and bears, but a deer on the road is a pretty bad animal. Or a bird sucked into the engine of an airplane is a pretty bad animal. So we have to look at it more extensively before we want to adjust the text of what we say. So that's the presentation, that's the Talmud, that's some of the halachos. Questions or comments before we go into a couple of specific situations, how they were addressed in more modern times. Yeah.
I noticed on the app I use, I guess it's the Siddur Art Scroll, there's additional things that you say 3 times each.
So I think that might have a bit of a longer text. Is that the Yaakov Halach Darko? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
So some versions have extended it. Some have over time. I think you'll see some of that sentiment expressed in some of these sources. The idea of different types of travel, air travel, saying certain things differently. So the basic, I guess, meat and potatoes main course is the one stop Yehi Ratzon.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, let's pull on a few of the strands of what the discussion entailed until now. This idea of positioning. You notice already in the Talmud and in the Shulchan Aruch, do you have to be in one place? Do you have to stand still? Like how the idea of the position in prayer is something that ideally should be standing still. And if you can't get off the animal, then then you can't get off the animal. And we would imagine being in a car would be the same way. So Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch addressed this. Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch, who is the head of the Eda HaCharedis in Jerusalem. He was a rabbi in Johannesburg, South Africa first. So he says, source number 5, what he thinks is Haderech HaNachon. What's the best way to do this? Shim nosea berechev prati o b'monit. If you're driving a car or in a taxi, ra'ui la'atzor v'laredes me'arechev. You should get out of the car, or you should tell the taxi driver to pull over. V'chein nahanti l'inyan tfilas haderech. You should. That's what I do personally. Ideally, you should be saying this blessing standing up. I asked the driver to stop, and I get out and say Tfilas Haderech. So many great rabbis, a number of great rabbis and righteous people have done so. This is a good segula. This is a good way of avoiding being damaged by these dangers, right? So there's kind of like a special spiritual advantage to saying the Tfilas Haderech in its optimal positioning, which is standing. Okay, it doesn't say you have to, but he says you want to be safe from dangerous animals. Especially sometimes drivers are worse than wild animals. So you have to, if you really want to be safe, if you can, he says, there's a spiritual advantage to standing for Tfilas Haderech. So that's his view. If you go back to, we saw that this seemed to be the Talmud's recommendation, but the Talmud seems to be more forgiving, and Rav Shmuel doesn't disagree, but does seem to encourage getting out, standing for Tfilas Haderech. Rabbi Moshe Stern, rabbi originally from Hungary and then in Brooklyn, when talking about this, he agrees that basically it should be standing. But then he says, "Ba'aviron she'efshar la'amod yivarach gam lechatchila miyusheves kamo bebuses u'mebechonos." He seems to be, if you're on a conveyance that's kind of moving and not really able to stop or able to stand, even though maybe technically you could stand in your seat, he seems to say you don't have a problem whatsoever lechatchila sitting down. And then he points out that with regard to distance, for example, we may give if you drive to the airport and you're not going in a situation where Tfilas Haderech is required on your ride to the airport, right? You live in close proximity, so you didn't say Tfilas Haderech on the way to the airport when the plane takes off. How does that actually work in terms of when do you say Tfilas Haderech? So he says, he says the best time to say Tfilas Haderech on an airplane is when it's taxiing towards takeoff. That is sufficient. And again, I don't know. I don't think that the runway is 2 kilometers. At the same time, he feels that that's the beginning of the journey. Saying within that period is the best time whatsoever. Okay, so you have positioning. You have those who really feel you should stand, and those who feel the standing was maybe more of a spiritual ideal, but a practical impossibility on an animal, on a car, on a bus, taking off on a plane. Now, when you start talking about air travel, and here, we were saying that this Tfilas Haderech is to arrive safely. Tfilas Haderech and Hagomel are somewhat linked, but not directly. Anytime you say Tfilas Haderech doesn't mean you say Gomel when you arrive, right? The Gomel blessing is on being saved in a certain way. The Talmud gives very specific categories of who says Gomel: someone who crosses the desert, someone who crosses the sea, someone who recovers from a threatening illness, and someone who's released from jail. Right? Those are
Rabbi Weinstock?
Yeah.
Rabbi Weeder says he never says Gomel on a plane.
So, all right,
so
correct. Yeah. And Gomel has the same way that we're trying to understand the rationale for Tfilas Haderech and the ideal situations and when are the right times. The Gomel, there are people who say Gomel anytime they get on an airplane, because you go up and go down, it's dangerous, or they feel it that way, and some will say you never say Tfilas Gomel and everything in between. But the idea of Tfilas Haderech seems to try and counter the danger of the road. The Gomel is really more when there's a feeling of relief or great, a reason to be grateful, right? You recover from a life-threatening illness, we can understand being different than, driving in, Manhattan, no matter how crazy the drivers are. So, but there is kind of a linkage, right? If you feel danger, then we can appreciate Tefillat Haderech. But Tefillat Haderech is about going on the road. It's to protect you from danger. There seems to be very specific regulations for Tefillat Haderech that require a bracha, which would indicate that it's not just about feeling danger. Let's say you're afraid to drive on the highway. If it doesn't matter if you're afraid to drive on the highway, if you're not going far enough or the like, then you don't say it. Or as with any prayer, you're saying a prayer because it's a religious response to a situation you find yourself in. So there's a little bit of a linkage in terms of Tefillat Haderech and Gomel, but they veer off in different directions. Especially as was mentioned there, sometimes people don't say Gomel ever when flying on a plane, and we'll come back to that. But the idea of Tefillat Haderech, how that works, the Talmud's talking about an animal, Talmud's talking about walking, right? But what about an airplane? And how is air travel looked at from a Tefillat Haderech perspective? So Rabbi Moshe Stern, elsewhere in his Be'er Moshe, source number 7, Nishalti im shari linsoa ba'aviron l'shem tiyul orak l'tzarach mitzvah parnasa shari. Are you allowed to take an airplane for leisure travel? Or can you only do it for a mitzvah or to make a living? And he says, Bizmanenu shemiyedei yom biyomo alfei alafim avironim porchim ba'avir nasu chikli nesiya regila shari. He says, look, it's standard. You got thousands of planes in the air. It's okay. But he points out, Bidoro shelefanenu hayu gedolei olam michlal magon milakach v'sifra meshiv shalom she'asru latus ba'aviron l'tzarach tiyul b'yama. There was a time when rabbis forbade personal or optional air travel because shechricha hazeka v'sakana, there was danger. Avata bizmanenu nishaneh ha'itim husak avim l'klei nesiya bitachon kimat yoser misfina. He says airplanes are even safer than boats. Everyone says it's okay. So again, this is just trying to understand the danger involved in taking a journey. And then he says, and he says air travel requires Tefillat Haderech, and you should say it fully with the bracha, and the idea that it is considered traveling. And when you go on a journey, you should say Tefillat Haderech. So, again, interesting historical note about air travel, and it could be the same, with lots of different things. They're dangerous when they're new, and they're less dangerous when they are old. But this idea of, he says very clearly that if you're on a plane, you say Tefillat Haderech, kind of makes sense. It doesn't matter, you're getting from point A to point B. Walking, driving, riding, flying, Tefillat Haderech. There seems to be that not everyone agreed with that. Source number 8 is from a response of Rav Ovadia Yosef, and we're looking at him mainly because he quotes Hagon Harogachivi, Rabbi Yosef Rosen. Rabbi Yosef Rosen was known as the Rogachover. He was the rabbi in Dvinsk, the city of Dvinsk in Poland, had two great sages who were contemporaries of each other. One was Rabbi Yosef Rosen, who was the rabbi in the Hasidic community in Dvinsk, and they had Rabbi Meir Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk, the non-Hasidic community. Two geniuses. Meir Simcha was known as the Meshech Chachma and the Or Sameach. Those were his contributions to Jewish learning. And the Rogachover was known as a genius, less so for his the books that he wrote, which are harder to understand. They talk about Rogachover had a very good sense of humor. So when he was a young boy, was applying to join the yeshiva, and the yeshiva was for older boys, and he was only around 12, 13 years old. The students in the yeshiva who were much older were kind of not very pleased that this young whippersnapper was joining their ranks, and they decided to kind of start up with him a little bit. And they said that you have a reputation for being very smart. You've learned a lot already at your young age. How much have you studied? And he said, half the Talmud. And they asked him, which half of the Talmud? And he replied, whichever half you ask me about. And so, that sharp wit it might be on display because it was said about him that he was asked about, you have to say Tefillas Haderech on a plane. And he replied, the Gemara in Chulin talks about the idea of the Shiluach Hakan, sending away the mother bird to get the eggs in the nest. And it says, let's say you find a nest at sea. So if you find the nest at sea, you have to send away the mother bird, right? And the Gemara says, but that's kind of strange because you don't have bird nests at sea. What happens if you had a bird's nest in the heavens? Because there's a verse that talks about Derech Nesher Bashamayim, the eagles fly in the heavens. So Yischayi b'shiluach hakan, you have to send away the mother's bird if you find a nest in the heavens. Now, how exactly that's going to work? The Gemara doesn't address, but the Gemara does say, Derech Nesher Akri, Derech Stama Lo Akri. Now, this is, you find a bird's nest in the heavens, that might be where the eagles fly, but that's not where you're going to find the nest. So, Hare Lamanu Sheba Avir Lo Nikra B'Shem Derech. Right? That's not the path, that's not a derech for people to be found on. The skies are not a pathway for people, and therefore you can't say Tefillas Haderech. Tefillas Haderech is on the road. It's not in the sky. And that was what the rugged Shover responded. Now, that would seem to be, if you fly, you never say Tefillas Haderech. Right? Before, Rosie mentioned people don't bench gomel after a flight, but here, the rugged Shover is saying you don't even say Tefillas Haderech. So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef says, "V'karach lo masha rugged Shavi lo amar kin el chedude de alma." He was just joking. V'lo linyan halacha lamasa, and it's not really practical halacha. And he points out that many people have commented about the rugged Shover that even though it's the two lines from the bottom, Hayag Gadol Ma'od B'Torah, V'chol Roz Lo Honestly, the rugged Shover knew everything. We don't always follow his halachic comments because they have not been fully articulated or explained. But there seems to be a situation that if you fly, you don't say Tefillas Haderech. All right, so in Be'er Moshe Stern, obviously it's a journey, it's a travel, say Tefillas Haderech. The rugged Shover, maybe tongue-in-cheek, you don't say Tefillas Haderech. Rabbi Herschel Schachter makes comments in the name of Rav Soloveitchik that Rav Soloveitchik introduced a different aspect into the Tefillas Haderech. So Rav Schachter, in his book Nefesh Harav, where he's talking about the various positions of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, quotes that the Rav saying that in the early years, Shebishanim Rishonos, top of source 9, Kishanasa Halach V'Shal Boston to New York, he would travel back and forth from Boston to New York, right? He taught in New York, he lived in Boston. Tamid Nahag Lomar Tefillas Haderech, he always said Tefillas Haderech. Ach kavur harbe shanim, as the years went by, hisragel kol kach la'nesia ba'aviron at shelo hayoloch shashas u'pachadim klal u'klal. He felt perfectly safe on the airplane. If you don't have any fear at all on the journey, you don't say Tefillas Haderech at all. Right? It's a prayer that you say when you're in danger. So he did not say Tefillas Haderech on the plane, right? If you don't feel any danger whatsoever, you don't say Tefillas Haderech, and that's what that's how Rav Schachter understood the Rav's understanding. The Rav said he didn't say Tefillas Haderech. Rav Schachter understood the Rav was following a position that Tefillas Haderech is a prayer in feeling in times of trouble, and therefore, if you don't feel in danger, you don't say Tefillas Haderech, and so no Tefillas Haderech on an airplane. So maybe the rugged Shover was commenting much earlier on in the history of air travel, but maybe there was more danger. But here we have this idea that of the practice of Rav Soloveitchik not to say Tefillas Haderech on the flights from Boston to New York, because he was so used to it and didn't feel anything. Again, we don't know any longer flights, or if you do feel danger, there seems to be this introduction of an idea of how dangerous you feel the journey is, whether or not to say Tefillas Haderech, and just kind of, the risks of flying versus driving. This is from a website, which is actually a personal injury lawyer's website. But they're talking about the dangers that are involved, right? Numbers don't lie. Air travel is significantly safer than road travel. Despite the occasional news of airplane accidents, data over the past 2 decades shows that flying is far less dangerous than driving a car. Air travel has a near zero injury rate. right? Just 0.007 injuries per 100 million miles, right? So that's stark contrast to the staggering number of injuries on U.S. highways, which were 48 million at the same time, right? So you have the fatality rate for air travel similarly impressive, right? Just 0.003 deaths per 100 million miles, right? Fatality rate for cars and trucks was 0.57 deaths per 100 million miles, 190 times higher than the fatality rate for air travel. It's clear that driving is far riskier than flying. So it could be that it's it's so safe to fly that maybe Tefillas Haderech is not necessary. And so want to circle back to something that we mentioned before, that you see Rav Soloveitchik's practice, as explained by Rav Shechter, introduces a different idea into Tefillas Haderech. Is it about the journey, or is it about wanting to feel safe, or praying to God to find that sense of confidence in the journey? And that could distinguish the discussion that we had about, do you say Hashem's name or not Hashem's name? Right? We saw that the halachic understanding of this prayer is that it has to be a certain distance at a certain point, not past a certain point, etc., etc. But maybe there is another aspect of Tefillas Haderech. The idea of Tefillas Haderech of just like anytime you feel a need to pray, you should pray. There's that aspect as well. And so if it's a blessing that is recited specific times, specific places under certain conditions, then that will depend where you are, how far into the journey, how close to the destination, whether you stopped, whether you intended to stop or not stop. And that is one way of understanding Tefillas Haderech. The other is the religious response to being on the path, to being on the journey, whether one feels the need to call upon God for protection, salvation, or peace of mind. And so Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky notes, when discussing this in his comments on Tefillas Haderech, source number 11, V'nir lefiani azdati lefizeh delo nema b'zeh suffik brachos Tefillas the suffik brachos. You shouldn't be so concerned about whether or not you have to say the bracha, but include God's name. Habemes kaimalam b'sveikos the levai shispal kol hayom. Right? He doesn't say this is about whether or not to say a bracha, but no, this is a tefillah. This is a prayer. And prayer, Talmud says, pray all day if you want. If you feel the need to pray, then you should pray. So, that distinction between whether Tefillas Haderech is really a prayer that comes from the heart or more of a blessing that's regulated by certain rules and regulations plays itself out in some of the laws of Tefillas Haderech. On the one hand, Shulchan Aruch seems to indicate various situations that require it or don't require it or might require it, and that's one direction to go. And then maybe you should or shouldn't say God's name in the blessing at the end. And then, it becomes a springboard or a runway to take off into the discussion that actually, is crystallized through air travel. Rogachover says, it's not a derech. But leaving that aside, Rav Soloveitchik's practice not to say Tefillas Haderech on flights that he had become accustomed to open up the distinction of Tefillas Haderech of whether you feel danger, whether you feel the need for assistance, whether you feel you want to say the prayer. And if that's the case, as Rabbi Kamenetsky says, say the prayer. Don't be so worried about how far you've been or how far you've gone or whether you're stopping. It's about how you feel, in which case the prayer can be fully articulated in its fullest form. And if that's the case, we have a different approach. Many in the Tefillas Haderech, if everyone ever went, especially on a school trip or a camp trip on the bus, they always let someone go up in the front and lead the Tefillas Haderech for everyone. And that is an extension of what we saw, that Tefillas Haderech is in the plural. It's in the plural, so if it's in the plural, one person saying it for everyone is maybe recommended. But if it is a prayer, the Mishnah Berurah teaches in the laws of prayer that in the second line, source number 12, Mishum derachamei nin hu tzarich alecha levakesh rachamim al atzmo. If you feel in danger, you should say your own prayer. He's talking within the context of the brachos that we say in Kriyas Shema in the morning, and how often the Chazan, especially this is the Sephardic practice, prays everything out loud, and whether or not everyone should be praying in an undertone or not. But he feels that if it's a prayer that has relevance to asking for things or as an expression of one's religious sentiment, then everyone should say that themselves. So Tefillas Haderech is more of a religious expression. It is not just a standardized blessing that one person can say for everybody else, but it's meant to express your own religious sentiment at that moment. maybe everyone should say their own Tefillat Haderech, and it doesn't have to be one person for everybody. I would imagine, this approach, I think, that we got on from Rav Soloveitchik's behavior and Rav Shechter's understanding of that. That's not kind of the mainstream approach. Mainstream approach at Tefillat Haderech goes down the path that we saw of the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch, and being concerned with the where and the when and how far and how and how how close and how far and the like. But the way Rav Shechter understands Rav Soloveitchik and the way Rabbi Kamenetsky understands Tefillat Haderech, that it's a religious expression, it's a prayer. There certainly seems to be. You say it when you feel it, and you could say it for yourself and express it yourself as well. So they kind of got me thinking, more recently in terms of, different situations, especially in light of the last few years, and more people being, a little bit ill at ease sometimes in Manhattan. And we'll see if that continues to become, I don't want, anywhere in New York City. I don't want to, indicate that those who live in the Queens or Staten Island seems a little more safe, but the Bronx, everyone there is, facing, rising hate and who knows what comes next. What about taking the subway? You're not necessarily traveling that far. Maybe it's a question of how you feel. I know some people have talked about, wanting to start, carrying pepper spray or something like that. If you feel that type of danger that you need to protect yourself, maybe anytime you go on a path that you take it with you, you should say the Tefillat Haderech. Again, if it's about a certain specific journey with distance in demarcations, then you enter the halachic conversation of saying it with or without a bracha. If it's about a religious sentiment of how you feel, the way Rabbi Shechter, Rabbi Kamenetsky explained it, then you have more grounds to, say it when you mean it or say it when you feel it for that Tefillat Haderech. So whether you're traveling far or not, we certainly have something to chew on with regards to Tefillat Haderech. Most importantly, everyone should stay safe. And with that, safe journeys, a happy Thanksgiving, joyous Chodesh Kislev. We're not meeting next week, but we'll pick up on December 9th.
I would